Scars of the heart, Clara. Whitmore's fingers trembled as she buttoned the high collar of her traveling dress. Each pearl button, a small fortress against the world's prying eyes. The mirror in the cramped train compartment showed only her face, pale, angular, unremarkable, except for the determined set of her jaw. But she knew what lay beneath the carefully arranged fabric, the twisted landscape of scars that mapped her left shoulder and arm like a cruel geography of pain. "Almost there, miss," the conductor called, his voice carrying the dust and weariness of 3 days' travel. Millbrook, Colorado territory, next stop. Her reflection wavered as the train rounded a mountain curve, and for a moment Clara saw not herself but the ghost of who she might have been, unmarked, beautiful, worthy of the love letter folded in her reticule. Marcus Dalton's words, penned in a careful hand, spoke of loneliness and hope of building a life together in the shadow of the Rockies. He had no idea what manner of woman answered his advertisement. The whistle's shriek announced their arrival, and Clara pressed her palm against the scarred flesh beneath her sleeve. Soon, very soon, she would see the exact moment when hope died in a stranger's eyes. The scars had been Clara's constant companions for 8 years now, ever since the night fire consumed everything she held dear. She still remembered the acrid smell of smoke, the terrifying roar of flames devouring her father's modest parsonage in Boston's North End. Papa had been conducting evening prayers when a kerosene lamp overturned the oil wound, spreading like liquid hellfire across the wooden floor. Clara had saved her sister first. Rosalie, then only 14 and beautiful even in sleep, had been pulled from her bed and pushed toward the window. But when Clara turned back for their parents, a burning beam crashed down, pinning her left side beneath its weight. The flames had kissed her skin with mouths of agony, marking her forever. Papa and Mama never made it out. In the years that followed, Clara had learned to live with more than physical scars. She'd endured the stares, the whispered conversations that ceased when she entered a room, the suitors who courted her for her father's memory, only to flee when they glimpsed what lay beneath her carefully chosen clothing. Each rejection carved deeper than the fire ever had, until she began to believe what their retreating footsteps proclaimed: she was damaged goods unworthy of love. Rosalie, meanwhile, had blossomed into a beauty that drew men like moths to flame. At 22, she possessed the porcelain skin and golden curls that graced the illustrations in ladies' magazines. But beauty without means was a precarious position, and their small inheritance from the church had dwindled to nearly nothing. Clara's seamstress wages barely kept them fed, let alone maintain the appearance Rosalie's suitors expected, which was why 3 months ago Clara had done something desperate and foolish. She'd answered an advertisement in the matrimonial section of a month-old newspaper a customer had left behind: rancher seeks wife. Widower, age 32, owns prosperous cattle ranch in Colorado territory. Desires woman of good character for companionship and management of household. Children welcome. Send photograph and references. M. Dalton Millbrook. She'd written the letter by candlelight, her best penmanship flowing across paper scented with the last of Mama's lavender sachets. She'd told him of her education, her domestic skills, her willingness to embrace frontier life. She'd mentioned her father's position, her moral upbringing, her desire for a quiet life away from the judgments of city society. She had not mentioned the scars, and she had not sent a photograph. Instead, she'd sent Rosalie's tintype, the one taken at the photographer's studio on Washington Street, where golden light caught her sister's beauty like sunbeams in spun silk. It was a lie born of desperation and self-loathing, a deception that had seemed reasonable in the dark hours when creditors knocked and hunger gnawed. Now, as the train wheezed to a stop at Millbrook's modest depot, Clara wondered if she'd made the greatest mistake of her life. "Mind the step, miss," the conductor warned as she gathered her carpet bag and stepped onto the platform. Millbrook was smaller than she'd expected, a collection of weathered buildings huddled against the mountainside like children seeking shelter. The depot itself was little more than a shed with pretensions, but the setting took her breath away. Mountains rose on all sides, their peaks crowned with snow, despite the October afternoon's warmth. The air was thin and clean, carrying scents of pine and sage that made her chest expand with something she hadn't felt in years: possibility. "Miss Whitmore." The voice was deep, roughened by wind and weather, and when Clara turned towards it, her heart nearly stopped. The man approaching was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that wanted cutting and eyes the color of a storm-swept sky. He moved with the careful confidence of someone accustomed to navigating obstacles, one hand trailing along the platform's edge. It was then she noticed the white-tipped cane, the slight unfocus in those beautiful eyes that spoke of a world seen through darkness. Marcus Dalton was blind. Mr. Dalton. Her voice emerged as barely a whisper. The same. His smile was warm, genuine, transforming his weathered features into something approaching handsome. I apologize for not recognizing you immediately. I'd hoped your voice might be familiar from... Well, I suppose letters don't convey such things, do they? He was making conversation, she realized, trying to put her at ease. He had no idea that she stood frozen in place, watching his face for the exact moment when understanding would dawn. Because surely he would know. Surely someone would have told him what kind of woman had stepped off the train. I trust your journey wasn't too arduous. I know it's a long way from Boston. It was educational. Clara managed her throat tight with the weight of imminent confession. Marcus laughed, a rich sound that made something flutter in her chest. Educational, I like that. Most folks just say it was dusty and uncomfortable. He gestured toward a waiting wagon. Shall we? I imagine you're eager to see your new home. Your new home. The words hung between them like a bridge she could never cross. Clara opened her mouth to speak the truth, to explain the deception, to save them both from the inevitable disappointment. But before she could have formed the words, another voice called out across the platform. Clara, Clara, is that you? Rosalie materialized from behind the depot building like a vision from a dream, her golden hair catching the afternoon light, her blue traveling dress hugging curves that made men stumble in the street. She was supposed to be back in Boston, supposed to be safe and far from this moment of reckoning. Rosalie, Clara's voice cracked on her sister's name. What are you doing here? I followed you, of course. Rosalie's laugh was like silver bells, drawing Marcus's attention as surely as her beauty drew every other man's. Did you think I'd let you run off to the wilderness without me? We're family, Clara. We stick together. Clara watched Marcus's face as Rosalie approached, saw the exact moment when his enhanced hearing painted a picture of feminine grace and confidence. His expression changed subtly, not the cruel shock she'd expected, but something worse, wonder. And you must be Mr. Dalton, Rosalie continued, extending her gloved hand with practiced charm. I'm Rosalie Whitmore, Clara's sister. She's told me so much about you in her letters. Marcus took the offered hand, and Clara saw him still as he processed the implications. The photograph, the beautiful woman in the tintype who bore no resemblance to the voice he'd been hearing. I see, he said, quietly, though of course he didn't see it all. Miss Rosalie, it's a pleasure. Clara stood frozen, watching the scene unfold like a carriage accident she was powerless to prevent. She should speak, she should explain, she should claim her place and accept whatever consequences followed. Instead, she heard herself saying, there's been a mistake, Mr. Dalton. A misunderstanding about which sister you were corresponding with. The words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples of consequence she couldn't take back. Marcus turned toward her, voice confusion evident in the tilt of his head. I'm afraid I don't understand. Clara's throat felt lined with sand. Around them, the depot had grown quiet except for the distant sound of the train preparing for departure. Even the mountains seemed to lean in, waiting for her next words. The photograph you received, she whispered. It wasn't of me. It was of Rosalie. I made an error in which image I enclosed with my letter. The lie tasted like ashes on her tongue. Marcus stood perfectly still for a long moment, processing this information with the careful deliberation of a man who'd learned not to trust first impressions. I see, he said again, and this time the words carried weight she couldn't interpret. So you are... I'm Clara, she said, her voice barely audible. But the photograph, the woman you were expecting to marry, that's Rosalie. She waited for his relief, for the polite but firm dismissal, for the awkward conversation about train schedules and return tickets. Instead, Marcus was quiet for so long that she wondered if he'd somehow retreated into himself. When he finally spoke, his words shattered every assumption she'd built. Miss Clara, may I ask you something? Of course, Mr. In your letters, you wrote about wanting a quiet life away from the judgments of society. What judgments were you referring to? The question hung in the mountain air like smoke. Clara felt Rosalie's curious gaze, heard the distant whistle of the departing train, smelled the sage and pine that would forever remind her of this moment when her carefully constructed deception began to crumble. I, she began then stopped. How could she explain without revealing everything? How could she make him understand the weight of being marked, of being found, wanting, of being the sister who would never be chosen? It doesn't matter now, she said finally. You have your bride, Mr. Dalton. Rosalie is everything the photograph promised and more. But even as she spoke the words, she caught something in Marcus's expression, a flicker of disappointment that seemed aimed not at her revelation, but at her retreat from it. Is that what you want, Miss Clara? He asked gently. For me to marry your sister? The question pierced her like a blade. What she wanted was impossible to be seen and known and loved despite her scars to build a life with a man who looked at her the way Marcus had looked in Rosalie's direction. But want was a luxury she'd given up long ago. It's what's best, she said the words feeling like a small death. Rosalie will make you a wonderful wife. And as she spoke, Clara began to plan her retreat back to Boston, back to her sewing machine and her small safe life, back to the shadows where damaged women belonged. She had no way of knowing that Marcus Dalton was thinking something else entirely. The turning point. Well then, Marcus said after a moment, that stretched like pulled taffy. I suppose we should discuss the practical arrangements. Clara felt her heart sink even as she told herself this was exactly what she'd expected. Of course he would want to marry Rosalie. Any man would. My ranch is 3 miles outside town. Marcus continued addressing both sisters, but somehow seeming to focus on Clara's voice. It's not luxurious by city standards, but it's comfortable. There's a main house and a smaller cabin that serves as quarters for my housekeeper, though Mrs. Henderson left last month to care for her ailing mother in Denver. Rosalie stepped closer, her voice taking on the breathy quality that made men forget their own names. How exciting! I've never lived on a ranch before. It sounds terribly romantic. Romantic, Marcus repeated, and Clara caught something odd in his tone, a distance that seemed to open even as Rosalie moved nearer. I suppose some might see it that way, though I should mention that ranch life involves considerable work. Managing the household, overseeing the children's education, helping with the books during roundup. Children, Rosalie's voice climbed an octave. My late brother's boy and girl, Tommy's 8, Sarah's 6. They've been with me since their parents died of fever 3 years ago. Marcus's voice softened when he mentioned them. They're good children, but they need a woman's guidance. Clara watched her sister's face transform as the reality of frontier motherhood settled over her like a cold blanket. Rosalie had never shown interest in children, finding them messy and demanding. The idea of teaching lessons and wiping noses would appeal to her about as much as mucking stables. Well, children are lovely, of course, Rosalie managed, but her enthusiasm had dimmed considerably. The position also requires someone comfortable with isolation. Marcus continued, seemingly oblivious to Rosalie's growing discomfort. Winter months can be particularly challenging. The nearest neighbor is the Morrison place 2 miles south, and Dr. Morrison is often away on calls. A woman needs to be self-sufficient, capable of making difficult decisions on her own. With each word, Clara watched her sister deflate further. The romantic vision of being a pampered rancher's wife was crumbling against the harsh realities of frontier life. But Clara felt something entirely different stirring in her chest. The challenges Marcus described didn't frighten her. They called to something deep within her, a competence born of years managing a household after their parents' death, of making impossible decisions with insufficient resources. Of course, Marcus added, almost as an afterthought, I would need to delay any wedding ceremony for at least a month. There are legal matters to arrange, bans to be posted. In the meantime, I had hoped my bride might serve as temporary housekeeper. The work is demanding but necessary. Rosalie's face went pale beneath her careful rouge. A month of cooking, cleaning, and caring for children in the wilderness, Clara could practically see her sister's thoughts that racing toward the next eastbound train. Mr. Dalton, Clara heard herself saying, perhaps I could serve as housekeeper while you and Rosalie become better acquainted. Both Marcus and Rosalie turned toward her with expressions of surprise, his thoughtful, hers relieved. That is, Clara continued quickly, I have considerable experience managing households. I could care for the children and oversee the domestic arrangements while you two court properly. It was a solution born of desperation, but as she spoke the words, Clara realized she meant them. The thought of leaving this mountain paradise, of returning to Boston's narrow streets and narrower minds, filled her with unexpected dread. How generous, Rosalie said, her relief evident. Clara has always been the practical one in our family. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his head tilted in that listening way of his. When he spoke, his words seemed carefully chosen. Miss Clara, that's very kind. But I wouldn't want to impose on your time. Surely you have your own plans, your own life to consider. I have no pressing obligations, Clara said, which was true enough. Her meager seamstress business could survive a few months' absence, and their Boston boarding house room was paid only through the end of October anyway. Very well, Marcus decided. Miss Clara, if you're willing to serve as housekeeper temporarily, I would be grateful for your assistance. The wages are $15 monthly, plus room and board. $15 was more than Clara earned in 2 months of sewing, but she hardly heard the amount over the thundering of her heart. A month. She would have a month in this beautiful place, a month to pretend she belonged somewhere other than the shadows. I accept, she said before courage could desert her. Marcus's smile was warm and genuine. Excellent. Shall we head to the ranch, then? The children will be eager to meet you both. As they loaded into his wagon, a sturdy affair that spoke of practical needs rather than comfort, Clara found herself sitting beside Marcus, while Rosalie perched behind them like a decorative bird. The arrangement felt natural somehow, with Clara close enough to provide guidance if needed, and Rosalie safely removed from any actual responsibility. Tell me about Boston, Marcus said as they left Millbrook behind. I've never been to a large city. Clara expected him to direct the question to Rosalie, but his face remained turned toward her. Perhaps it was simply politeness, or perhaps blindness made conversation more democratic. Whatever the reason, Clara found herself describing their hometown with unexpected eloquence. The common in spring, the harbor bells in fog, the way snow transformed even the humblest neighborhoods into something magical. You paint beautiful pictures with words, Marcus said when she finished. I can almost see it. The compliment sent warmth spreading through Clara's chest, a sensation so foreign she almost didn't recognize it as pleasure. When had anyone last praised her for anything beyond her stitching or her ability to stretch a dollar? Clara's always been the storyteller, Rosalie said from behind them, her voice carrying a note Clara couldn't quite identify. She reads voraciously. Father used to say she had enough stories in her head for 3 people. A useful skill on a ranch, Marcus observed. Children need stories, especially during long winter evenings. As they climbed higher into the mountains, Clara felt herself relaxing for the first time in months. The wagon seat was hard and the mountain air thin, but something about this man's presence, his calm competence, his obvious kindness, made her feel safer than she had since childhood. Perhaps a month wouldn't be nearly long enough. Rising action. The Dalton Ranch spread before them like something from a dream Clara hadn't dared to have. The main house was built of honey-colored logs with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides, while outbuildings dotted the landscape like a child's toys scattered across green felt. Mountains rose on all sides, their peaks painted gold by the setting sun, and a stream meandered through pastures where cattle grazed in peaceful contentment. It's beautiful, Clara breathed, forgetting for a moment that beauty was supposed to be Rosalie's domain. Is it? Marcus asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. I know the layout by heart, of course, but I sometimes wonder what it looks like to someone seeing it for the first time. Like a sanctuary, Clara said without thinking, then blushed at her own honesty. Before Marcus could respond, the front door burst open and 2 small figures tumbled onto the porch. The boy was all knees and elbows, his dark hair falling into eyes that were unmistakably Marcus's. The girl beside him was a sprite, with braids the color of autumn leaves and a dress that had seen better days. Uncle Marcus, the boy called, bounding down the steps. Did you bring us a new mama? Clara felt her throat close as both children stopped short, their eyes moving between the 2 sisters with obvious confusion. She braced herself for the inevitable, the moment when their gazes would fix on Rosalie's golden beauty, and she would become invisible once more. Instead, the little girl stepped closer to Clara, her head tilted in unconscious mimicry of her uncle. Are you the lady from the letters, the one who knows about books and sewing and making things grow? The question pierced Clara's heart. Marcus had told them about her letters not just the photograph. Somehow that mattered more than she could have imagined. I'm Clara, she said, kneeling to bring herself to the child's eye level. And you must be Sarah. How did you know? Sarah's eyes widened with delight. Because your uncle told me about a very special little girl who loves stories and helps take care of the chickens. Sarah beamed, and Clara felt something shift inside her chest, a door opening that she'd thought was permanently sealed. And I'm Tommy, the boy announced, not to be outdone. I can ride almost as good as Uncle Marcus, and I know all the names of the cattle. Want to see Tommy, Marcus said gently. Remember your manners. This is Miss Rosalie, who traveled all the way from Boston to meet us. The children turned dutifully toward Rosalie, who had been watching the exchange with an expression Clara couldn't quite read. Her sister smiled and said all the appropriate things, but Clara noticed how she kept her distance, how her hands remained carefully gloved and folded. Why don't you children help Miss Clara get settled in the housekeeper's quarters? Marcus suggested. She'll be staying with us for a while. Yeah, really? Sarah's face lit up like Christmas morning. Will you tell us stories and teach us things Mrs. Henderson never wanted to teach us anything except sitting still? I would love to, Clara said, meaning it completely. As the children led her toward the smaller cabin behind the main house, Clara caught Marcus's voice carrying on the evening air. Miss Rosalie, perhaps you'd like to see your room in the main house. I hope you'll find it comfortable. The housekeeper's cabin was small but charming, with a stone fireplace, a comfortable bed, and windows that looked out over the mountains. Someone had left wildflowers in a mason jar on the table, and Clara suspected she knew which small person was responsible. Do you really know stories? Sarah asked, perching on the edge of the bed, like a hopeful bird. Hundreds of them, Clara assured her. What about the one where the princess saves the prince? Tommy asked, trying to sound nonchalant. Mrs. Henderson said there were no such stories, but I think there should be. Clara's heart ached for this boy who'd lost his parents and needed to believe in salvation. There absolutely are such stories, she said firmly, and I know several. That evening after supper in the main house's warm kitchen, Clara found herself in the parlor with all four Daltons. Rosalie had retired early with a headache, claiming the mountain air disagreed with her, leaving Clara to oversee the children's bedtime routine. Once upon a time, Clara began, the children nestled on either side of her on the sofa while Marcus listened from his chair by the fire. There was a kingdom where no one could see. Not the king, not the queen, not any of the people. They had learned to navigate their world through touch and sound and smell, and they were quite happy. How could they be happy if they couldn't see? Sarah asked. Because they had learned to see with their hearts, Clara explained. They could tell if someone was kind by the gentleness of their voice, if someone was brave by the steadiness of their step, if someone was beautiful by the warmth of their laughter. She felt rather than saw Marcus lean forward slightly, his attention focused entirely on her words. One day a sighted princess came to their kingdom. She was very beautiful on the outside, with golden hair and perfect skin, but she had never learned to see with her heart. The people of the kingdom tried to welcome her, but she kept insisting that they were wrong about everything because they couldn't see how things really looked. What happened? Tommy asked. The princess had to choose, Clara said. She could learn to see with her heart like the people of the kingdom, or she could remain alone with only her mirror for company. Which did she choose? Sarah whispered. Clara glanced toward Marcus, who was perfectly still in his chair. She chose to learn, Clara said softly. And when she did, she discovered that the kingdom was more beautiful than she had ever imagined, because beauty that comes from the heart never fades. The children were quiet for a moment, processing the story's meaning with the seriousness that only children could bring to important truths. I like that story, Sarah said finally. Can you tell us another one tomorrow? Every night, Clara promised. After tucking the children into their beds, Clara found Marcus still in the parlor, staring into the dying fire with an expression she couldn't read. Thank you, he said without looking up, for the story, for the way you spoke to them. They haven't been that animated since their parents died. They're wonderful children, Clara said, meaning it. You've done well with them. Marcus's laugh was rueful. Have I? Sometimes I wonder if they need more than I can give them. A woman's touch, a mother's wisdom. They need love, Clara said firmly. Everything else can be taught. Marcus turned toward Bauer, then his storm-gray eyes seeming to look directly into hers despite his blindness. Is that what you believe, that love is enough? The question hung between them like a challenge, and Clara felt her carefully constructed walls begin to tremble. I believe, she said carefully, that love sees what truly matters. And what is that? The heart beneath the surface. The soul that chooses kindness over cruelty, sacrifice over selfishness. Clara's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. The person someone becomes when they think no one is watching. Marcus was quiet for so long that Clara began to worry she'd revealed too much. But when he spoke, his words sent warmth spiraling through her chest. I think, he said slowly, that you see very clearly, Miss Clara. Perhaps more clearly than most people who have the use of their eyes. The next few weeks fell into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. Clara rose before dawn to start breakfast, her movements efficient and sure in the kitchen. She was rapidly learning to love. The children would tumble downstairs like puppies, eager for the day's adventures, while Marcus emerged with his hair still damp from washing and his shirt sleeves rolled up for work. Breakfast became Clara's favorite time of day. The kitchen filled with golden light and easy conversation, the children chattering about their plans, while Marcus listened with the focused attention that made everyone feel heard. Clara found herself telling stories from Boston, describing the street vendors in the changing seasons, the immigrants' colorful markets, and the grand houses on Beacon Hill. You make it sound like a fairy tale, Marcus said one morning. His coffee cup paused halfway to his lips. Every place is a fairy tale if you know how to look at it, Clara replied, then blushed at her own whimsy. Tell us about the ugly places, too, Tommy demanded. The scary parts. Clara hesitated, thinking of the tenements where families crowded into single rooms of the children who begged them on street corners while their parents worked 16-hour days in factories. But then she looked at Tommy's earnest face and realized he needed to know that darkness existed and that people could survive it. There were hard places too, she said carefully. Places where people had to be very brave just to get through each day. But even there you could find beauty if you looked hard enough. A flower growing between cobblestones, a mother singing to her baby neighbors, sharing what little they had. Like here, Sarah said thoughtfully. When Mrs. Henderson got sick, everyone brought food and took turns sitting with her. Exactly like here, Clara agreed, catching Marcus's approving nod from the corner of her eye. After breakfast, Marcus would head out to work the ranch while Clara managed the household and taught the children their lessons. She discovered that Sarah had a quick mind for numbers, while Tommy devoured stories like a starving man faced with a feast. Both children were eager to learn, and Clara found herself drawing on every scrap of education she'd absorbed in her father's house. Why do you know so much? Tommy asked one afternoon, as Clara helped him parse a particularly difficult passage in his reader. Because someone once told me that knowledge is the one thing no one can take away from you, Clara said, thinking of her father's gentle voice. No matter what happens, what you learn becomes part of who you are. In the afternoons, while the children played or napped, Clara threw herself into transforming the house. She aired out musty rooms, organized cluttered spaces, and coaxed the neglected garden back to life. The physical work felt good, purposeful, in a way her seamstress duties never had. Marcus often found her during these afternoon labors, appearing with offers of help, or simply settling nearby to talk while she worked. Clara grew to treasure these conversations, the way he listened to her opinions about everything from crop rotation to child rearing, the respect he showed for her intelligence. You have good instincts, he said one day, watching her transplant struggling herbs to a sunnier spot. How did you know they needed more light? Plants are like people, Clara said, not looking up from her work. They show you what they need if you pay attention. These days were reaching toward the window, stretching themselves thin, trying to find what they were missing. And you think people do that too, reach toward what they need. Clara's hands stilled in the dirt. Don't you? Ooh, Marcus considered this, his face thoughtful. I suppose I do, though I'm not always sure I recognize what I'm reaching for. On the comment hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning, Clara didn't dare interpret. Instead, she focused on the herbs, on the simple satisfaction of giving growing things what they needed to thrive. But it was the evenings that truly undid her. After supper, they would gather in the parlor, she and Marcus and the children, with Rosalie usually absent with another headache or early bedtime. Clara would tell stories while mending clothes or working on embroidery, the firelight casting dancing shadows on the walls. Marcus would listen from his chair, sometimes asking questions that revealed how closely he followed every word. Where do all these stories come from? He asked one night after she'd finished a particularly elaborate tale about a dragon who collected beautiful things but never understood their true value. Books mostly, Clara said, threading her needle with steady hands. My father had a wonderful library, and sometimes, she hesitated, then decided on honesty. Sometimes I make them up. The one about the dragon that was yours. Clara nodded, then remembered he couldn't see the gesture. Yes, it was brilliant, Marcus said softly. The way you described how the dragon learned that collecting beauty was different from appreciating it, that hoarding something away from the world diminishes rather than preserves it. Clara's needle slipped, pricking her finger. She pressed the tiny wound to her lips, tasting copper and something that might have been tears. Careful, Marcus said, rising from his chair. Are you hurt? Just a pinprick, Clara assured him, but he was already moving toward her with that sure grace that never failed to amaze her. Let me see, he said, kneeling beside her chair. Before Clara could protest, Marcus had taken her hand in both of his fingertips tracing over her palm until he found the tiny drop of blood on her index finger. His touch was gentle, careful, and Clara felt her breath catch as he examined the small wound. It's nothing serious, he said, but he didn't release her hand. Instead, his fingers moved across her palm, mapping the calluses from years of sewing, the small scars from countless needle pricks, the roughness that marked her as a woman who worked with her hands. Your hands tell stories too, Marcus said quietly. Stories of someone who creates, who mends, who makes things better than she found them. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs as his exploration moved to her wrist, where her pulse beat visibly beneath pale skin. She should pull away, should remember her place, should think of Rosalie sleeping upstairs in the room that was meant to be the lady of the house's domain. Instead, she sat perfectly still. As Marcus's fingers traced the delicate bones of her wrist, the tendons that flexed beneath his touch, the subtle transition from smooth skin to the raised ridges that marked where fire had claimed her 8 years ago. Marcus went perfectly still. His fingers rested on the edge of her scars, and Clara felt the exact moment when understanding dawned. Clara, he said, her name barely a breath. She tried to pull away, then mortification flooding through her like ice water, but Marcus's grip tightened gently, holding her in place. Please don't, she whispered. Don't look, don't touch. Why not? The question was so simple, so genuinely puzzled, that Clara felt her careful composure begin to crack. Because they're ugly, she said the words, scraping her throat raw. Because they're damaged, wrong. Marcus's thumb moved across the raised flesh with infinite tenderness, tracing patterns that fire had carved into her skin. They feel like courage to me, he said softly. Like survival, like someone who loved enough to risk everything, even if it cost her dearly. Clara's breath came in short, sharp gasps as 8 years of shame warred with the impossible gentleness in Marcus's voice. No one had ever touched her scars voluntarily. No one had ever called them anything but tragic, pitiful, unfortunate. How can you say that? She whispered. Marcus's hand moved to cup her scarred forearm, his palm warm against the twisted skin. Because I can feel the story they tell. Fire, yes, but also bravery, also love, also a woman who chose to save others before herself. His thumb traced a particularly raised ridge. How did it happen? Clara closed her eyes, remembering. A fire. Our house. I got Rosalie out first, then went back for our parents. A beam fell. And you stayed conscious, fought your way out. I had to. There was no one else. Marcus's other hand found her face, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw with reverent care. Then these scars are proof of the most beautiful thing in the world, a heart willing to sacrifice for love. How could anyone see them as anything but magnificent? Clara felt tears spill over, running down her cheeks to pool against Marcus's fingers. For 8 years, she'd carried these marks like a brand of unworthiness. To hear them called magnificent, to feel them touched with reverence rather than revulsion, it was almost too much to bear. I've spent so long believing I was broken, she whispered. You're not broken, Marcus said firmly. You're marked by love. There's a difference. The moment stretched between them, fragile and precious, until the sound of footsteps on the stairs broke the spell. Marcus released her hand and moved back to his chair just as Rosalie appeared in the doorway, her golden hair loose around her shoulders and her nightgown pristine white. Oh, Rosalie said, taking in the scene with eyes that missed nothing. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Miss Clara pricked her finger on her sewing needle, Marcus explained smoothly. I was merely ensuring she wasn't seriously injured. How thoughtful, Rosalie said, but something in her tone made Clara look up sharply. Her sister's expression was pleasant controlled, but Clara caught a flicker of something dangerous in her blue eyes. I came down for a glass of water, Rosalie continued. The mountain air makes me so thirsty. As her sister moved toward the kitchen, Clara gathered her sewing with hands that trembled only slightly. The moment with Marcus felt like a dream too precious and fragile to survive the harsh light of reality. I should say good night, Clara said, not trusting herself to look at Marcus directly. Of course. Sleep well, Miss Clara. But as Clara made her way to the housekeeper's cabin, she could feel Rosalie's eyes following her every step. Worst complication, community judgment. Sunday morning brought Clara's first real test as acting lady of the Dalton household. The small church in Millbrook was the social center of the community where reputations were made and unmade with surgical precision. Clara dressed carefully in her best dark blue dress, the high collar and long sleeves hiding every trace of scarred skin, and helped the children into their Sunday clothes. Do I have to wear the towel? Tommy complained, tugging at the offending neckwear. Yes, Clara said firmly, straightening the knot with practiced hands. Because when we represent the Dalton family, we do it properly. Will there be other children at church? Sarah asked, smoothing her skirts with nervous hands. I'm sure there will be, and they'll be lucky to meet such a smart, kind girl. The drive into town was pleasant with Marcus handling the reins with his usual competence, while Clara pointed out landmarks to the children. Rosalie sat beside her in careful silence, every golden curl perfectly arranged and her blue silk dress a masterpiece of Eastern fashion. The church itself was a simple white building with clear windows and hard wooden pews, but it was packed with what seemed like half the territory. Clara felt the weight of curious stares as they filed into a pew near the front, heard the whispered conversations that buzzed like angry wasps. That's her, she caught from somewhere behind them. The housekeeper's sister. Mighty convenient arrangement, if you ask me. Poor Mr. Dalton doesn't know what he's gotten himself into. Clara kept her eyes fixed on the altar, her hands folded in her lap, but she could feel the speculation rolling over her like a suffocating wave. Beside her, the children sat unusually quiet, picking up on the adult tensions, even if they didn't understand them. After the service, the congregation gathered in the churchyard for the social hour that was really an extended session of news sharing and judgment passing. Clara would have preferred to head straight home, but Marcus was immediately surrounded by men wanting to discuss cattle prices and weather patterns, leaving the women to circle around Rosalie and Clara like sharks scenting blood. Miss Rosalie, said a sharp-faced woman in an elaborate bonnet, what a lovely dress. So fashionable. The emphasis on the last word made it clear that fashionable was not necessarily considered a virtue in Millbrook. Thank you, Mrs. Rosalie's smile was perfectly polite, but Clara caught the steel beneath it. Abernathy, my husband owns the mercantile. The woman's eyes moved to Clara with unmistakable calculation. And you must be the sister. How unusual to have both of you staying at the ranch. Miss Claire is our housekeeper, Sarah piped up with fierce loyalty. She tells the best stories, and she's teaching us about plants, and she makes the most wonderful biscuits. Mrs. Abernathy's smile sharpened. How fortunate for Mr. Dalton to have such comprehensive assistance. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks at the implication, but before she could respond, another voice cut through the tension. Margaret Abernathy, are you bothering these young ladies? The newcomer was an elderly man with kind eyes and a medical bag, and Clara recognized him as Dr. Morrison from Marcus's descriptions. Dr. Morrison? Mrs. Abernathy said, her tone shifting to sugary sweetness. I was simply welcoming our new arrivals to the community. I'm sure you were. The doctor's dry tone suggested he knew exactly what kind of welcome was being offered. Miss Clara, isn't it? Marcus mentioned you'd be helping with the children. Sarah, Tommy, how are your studies progressing? The children launched into an enthusiastic description of their lessons, and Clara felt some of the tension leave her shoulders as the doctor listened with genuine interest. Here at least was someone who seemed willing to judge her on her merits rather than her circumstances. Remarkable progress, Dr. Morrison said when they finished. Marcus chose well when he asked for your help, Miss Clara. Thank you, Doctor. The children are eager learners. And what of your studies, Miss Rosalie? Mrs. Abernathy interjected, not willing to be sidelined for long. Have you been helping with the children's education as well? Rosalie's smile wavered slightly. I'm afraid I've been somewhat indisposed since arriving. The altitude you understand. Of course, Mrs. Abernathy said with false sympathy. Oh, frontier life can be quite an adjustment for those accustomed to easier circumstances. Clara saw her sister flinch at the subtle barb and felt a protective anger rise in her chest. Whatever Rosalie's fault, she didn't deserve to be torn apart by this pack of gossips. My sister has been invaluable in helping me understand the household routines, Clara said smoothly. Her suggestions have improved our efficiency considerably. It was a lie, but a kind one, and Clara saw Rosalie's grateful glance from the corner of her eye. How wonderful, Dr. Morrison said, and Clara suspected he saw through her diplomacy, but appreciated the intent. Community cooperation is essential out here. We all succeed or fail together. The conversation moved on to safer topics, but Clara remained aware of the undercurrent of speculation that followed them throughout the social hour. She was the subject of countless sideways glances and whispered conferences, and she knew that by evening, half the territory would have heard some version of the story of the Whitmore sisters and their unusual arrangement with Marcus Dalton. On the drive home, Rosalie was unusually quiet, staring out at the passing landscape with an expression Clara couldn't read. Penny for your thoughts, Clara said gently. Rosalie was quiet for so long that Clara thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was small and uncertain. They think I'm useless, don't they? The town women. Clara felt her heart clench at the vulnerability in her sister's voice. They think you're different. That doesn't make you useless. But I am, aren't I? Rosalie's laugh was bitter. I can't cook worth a damn. I don't know the first thing about caring for children, and the idea of spending winter trapped in the mountains makes me want to run screaming back to Boston. Rosalie, don't. Rosalie held up a hand, her composure cracking. Don't make excuses for me, Clara. We both know the truth. You're the one who belongs here. You're the one who fits. The admission hung in the air between them, loaded with 8 years of unspoken truths. Clara wanted to deny it to offer comfort, but she found herself thinking of the way Marcus listened when she spoke, the way the children gravitated toward her stories, the satisfaction she felt making the house a home. I'm not trying to take anything from you, Clara said quietly. Aren't you? Rosalie's voice was sharp now, all trace of vulnerability gone. Because from where I sit, it looks like you're taking everything. Second complication. Growing intimacy and guilt. The confrontation with Rosalie haunted Clara through the following days, adding a layer of guilt to every interaction with Marcus. She tried to maintain proper distance to remember her place as employee rather than whatever she was becoming. But Marcus seemed determined to make that impossible. He began finding excuses to work near the house during her afternoon chores, appearing to repair a loose shutter just as she hung laundry, or to check the kitchen pump while she prepared dinner. At first, Clara told herself these were legitimate maintenance needs, but when she caught him hammer in hand, staring off into the distance while she sang softly to herself as she worked, she realized the truth. He was listening to her, the way she'd seen him listen to birdsong at dawn, with a focused attention that made her feel precious and exposed. You have a beautiful voice, he said one afternoon, appearing at the kitchen window while she kneaded bread dough. Clara's hands stilled in the warm dough. I didn't realize anyone could hear me. I wasn't eavesdropping intentionally, but sound carries differently. When you can't see, you learn to pay attention to every note. Marcus climbed through the open window with the casual ease of a man thoroughly comfortable in his environment, and Clara found herself intensely aware of his presence in the small kitchen. He moved to the sink to wash his hands, and Clara tried not to notice the way his work shirt stretched across his shoulders or the controlled strength in his movements. What song was that? He asked, drying his hands on the towel she offered. Just something my mother used to sing. A lullaby, really. Clara returned to her kneading, using the rhythmic motion to calm her racing pulse. Would you sing it again? The request was so simple, so gently asked, that Clara found herself humming the melody before she'd consciously decided to comply. Marcus leaned against the counter, his face turned toward her voice, and Clara felt something dangerous unfurl in her chest. My mother sang that to me when I was small, she said when the song ended. After nightmares or when I was sick. It always made me feel safe. It makes me feel the same way, Marcus said quietly. Their eyes met, or rather, Clara looked into his face while he seemed to look directly back at her, and the moment stretched between them like a bridge neither dared cross. Miss Clara, Sarah's voice from the doorway broke the spell. Can you help me with my arithmetic? Of course, sweetheart, Clara said, grateful for the interruption, even as part of her mourned its necessity. As Sarah settled at the kitchen table with her slate, Marcus lingered for a moment longer than necessary. Thank you, he said softly, for the song, for everything. After he left, Clara found herself pressing her floury hands to her burning cheeks, wondering what exactly she was doing and why it felt so much like falling. The evening brought no relief from the growing tension. Rosalie appeared for dinner in a dress that showcased her considerable assets. Her conversation bright and determined as she tried to engage Marcus in discussions of Boston society and cultural pursuits. I do so miss the theater, she said, cutting her roast beef with delicate precision. The costumes, the music, the romance of it all. Do you think Millbrook will ever have such entertainments? I doubt it, Marcus replied honestly. Most folks here are more concerned with practical matters, getting crops in, preparing for winter, making sure their families are fed and housed. How rustic, Rosalie said, and Clara caught the faint note of disdain in her sister's voice. Clara makes us entertainments, Tommy announced through a mouthful of potatoes. She tells stories and teaches us songs, and yesterday she showed us how to make shadow puppets on the wall. How creative, Rosalie said, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. Perhaps you'd like to join us this evening, Marcus suggested politely. I'm sure the children would enjoy hearing about your experiences in Boston. Rosalie brightened. I'd be delighted. But when they gathered in the parlor after supper, it became clear that Rosalie's idea of entertainment differed sharply from what the children craved. Her stories were all about parties and pretty dresses, social gatherings, and romantic intrigues that went completely over Tommy and Sarah's heads. Tell us about the Fire Princess, Sarah interrupted, during a particularly elaborate description of a society wedding. The one who could melt mean people's hearts. Oh, that's one of Clara's made-up stories, Rosalie said dismissively. I prefer real events, real people. But the made-up ones are more fun, Tommy protested. They have magic and adventures, and people learn all important things. Real life is adventure enough, Rosalie insisted, but Clara could see she was losing her audience. The children's attention wandered, and even Marcus seemed to be listening with only half his focus. Perhaps, Clara said carefully, we could tell a story together. Rosalie could describe a beautiful ball gown, and I could tell about the person wearing it and what adventures she might have. It was an attempt at compromise, a way to include her sister while giving the children what they wanted. But Rosalie's face flushed with embarrassment and something that looked suspiciously like anger. I'm sure my poor efforts can't compete with Clara's creativity, she said stiffly. Perhaps I should retire and leave the storytelling to the expert. She swept from the room with wounded dignity, leaving an uncomfortable silence in her wake. Did we hurt her feelings? Sarah asked in a small voice. Sometimes, Clara said carefully, people feel sad when they think they're not good at something that seems important to others. But she's good at lots of things, Tommy protested. She's pretty and she knows about fancy parties and she has really nice dresses. Those are wonderful things to be good at, Clara agreed. But maybe they're not the same things that matter most in a house with children who need stories and songs. Marcus said nothing, but Clara caught the thoughtful expression on his face and wondered what he was thinking. That night, as Clara prepared for bed in the small cabin, she found herself staring out the window at the main house where light still glowed in what she knew was Rosalie's room. Guilt gnawed at her stomach like hunger. She wasn't trying to usurp her sister's place, but with every passing day, it became clearer that she fit into this life in ways Rosalie never would. The question was, what was she going to do about it? Third complication, the storm and its revelations. The answer came 3 days later in the form of a late October blizzard that roared down from the high peaks like the wrath of God. Clara had noticed the signs all afternoon, the way the cattle huddled together in the lower pastures, the unusual silence of the birds, the heavy gray clouds that built against the mountains like a wall. Storm coming, Marcus confirmed at dinner, his weather sense more reliable than any barometer. A big one by the feel of it. We'll need to bring in extra firewood and make sure the stock are secured. By evening, the first snowflakes were falling, not the gentle drift of autumn snow, but hard-driving pellets that stung the skin and promised worse to come. Marcus spent the twilight hours checking outbuildings and securing loose items, while Clara battened down the house and prepared for what might be days of confinement. Will we be safe? Sarah asked, watching the wind whip snow against the parlor windows. Perfectly safe, Clara assured her, though she couldn't help but think of the stories she'd heard about mountain storms that buried entire homesteads under drifts 20 feet deep. By midnight, the storm was in full fury. Wind howled around the house like a living thing, rattling windows and sending smoke puffing back down the chimney, despite Marcus's careful adjustments to the flue. Clara lay in her narrow bed in the cabin, listening to the house timbers groan under the assault and wondering if the morning would bring disaster. She was just drifting off to sleep when she heard a crash, followed by a child's terrified scream. Clara was out of bed and running toward the main house before she'd fully processed the sound, her nightgown and wrapper, no protection against the driving snow. The back door was blocked by a drift, forcing her to fight her way around to the front porch, where she found the door standing open and snow swirling into the hallway. Marcus, she called, but the wind snatched her voice away. She found them in the kitchen, Marcus kneeling beside Tommy, who lay unconscious on the floor surrounded by broken glass and scattered firewood. Blood ran from a gash on the boy's forehead, stark against his pale skin. What happened? Clara dropped to her knees beside them, her hands automatically checking Tommy for other injuries. Tree branch came through the kitchen window, Marcus said, his voice tight with worry. Scared him awake, and he came down to investigate. Must have slipped on the snow that blew in. Clara's heart clenched as she saw the size of the gash. It would need stitches, and Dr. Morrison was 2 miles away through impassable roads. We have to get him to the doctor, she said. Can't. Marcus's voice was grim. Roads will be blocked for days. We're on our own. Sarah appeared in the doorway, her face white with terror. Is Tommy going to die? No, Clara said firmly, though her own heart was hammering with fear. But I need you to help me. Can you do that? Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. Good girl. Go to the linen closet and bring me the cleanest sheets you can find. Then heat water on the stove as much as you can. As Sarah ran to obey, Clara turned back to Tommy's still form. The bleeding was slowing, but the wound was deep and would definitely need stitching. In Boston, she'd helped her father tend injured parishioners, but this was far beyond anything she'd dealt with before. I'll have to sew it, she said more to herself than to Marcus. Can you heat? His face was tense with worry, but his voice held complete faith in her ability. I'll have to, Clara repeated, drawing strength from his confidence. The next few hours passed in a blur of careful work. Clara cleaned the wound with hot water and whiskey, her hands steady despite her terror. She'd sewn countless seams but never living flesh, and the responsibility weighed on her like a physical burden. Talk to him, she told Marcus as she threaded her finest needle. He needs to hear your voice. Marcus began talking about spring roundups and fishing in the stream, about the horse he was training, especially for Tommy, and the hunting trip they'd take when the boy was older. His voice was calm, steady, a lifeline in the chaos of the storm. Clara worked by lamplight while the wind howled outside, taking tiny, careful stitches in skin that felt impossibly fragile beneath her fingers. When she finally tied off the last suture, she was shaking with exhaustion and relief. It's done, she whispered. Tommy stirred as she bandaged the wound, his eyes fluttering open to focus on her face. Clara, he mumbled. Did I break something? Just the window, she said, smoothing his hair back from his forehead. And maybe scared us all to death. Sorry, he said, then winced as he tried to sit up. Easy, Marcus said, his hand gentle on the boy's shoulder. You took quite a knock. Clara had to play doctor and sew you back together. Tommy's eyes widened as he touched the bandage gingerly. Like mending a shirt. Something like that, Clara agreed, blinking back tears of relief. They moved Tommy to the sofa in the parlor, where the fire was warmest, and they could keep watch over him. Sarah curled up in the chair beside him, refusing to leave her brother's side, while Marcus and Clara took turns monitoring his condition through the night. It was during the small hours when Tommy was sleeping peacefully and Sarah had finally dozed off that Clara found herself alone with Marcus by the dying fire. The storm still raged outside, but somehow the violence seemed distant, now held at bay by warm walls and the gentle breathing of sleeping children. You saved his life, Marcus said quietly. Anyone would have done the same. No. Marcus turned toward her with that focused attention that always made her feel seen. Not anyone. It takes skill, courage, and steady hands. Most people would have panicked. Clara thought of the terror that had gripped her when she first saw Tommy's injury, the way her hands had shaken as she threaded the needle. I was terrified. But you did it anyway. That's what courage is, not the absence of fear, but action in spite of it. Marcus reached for her hand, and this time Clara didn't pull away. His fingers traced over her knuckles, worn and pricked from years of sewing, then moved to her wrist, where her pulse beat quick and light. Clara, he said, her name a question and a prayer. I know, she whispered. I know we can't. I know this isn't. She's upstairs, Marcus. Your intended bride is sleeping in the room that should be hers by right. Is she? Marcus's thumb traced over the delicate bones of her wrist. Because it seems to me that the woman who belongs in this house, who fits into this life like she was made for it, is sitting right here. Clara's breath caught as Marcus lifted their joined hands, pressing her palm against his chest, where his heart beat strong and steady beneath her fingers. Feel that, he said. That's what happens when you're near me. When you sing while you work, when you tell the children stories, when you move through my house like you belong there. Because you do belong here, Clara. Not as a housekeeper, not as a temporary solution, but as the woman I want to build a life with. You don't understand, Clara said desperately. You can't see what I really look like. The scars, the damage. I can see exactly what you look like. Marcus interrupted, his free hand moving to cup her face. You look like strength and kindness in grace under pressure. You look like home. His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone, and Clara felt 8 years of careful defenses crumble like a dam in flood. I've been half in love with you since that first day at the station, Marcus continued. When you tried to give your place to your sister, when you put her happiness above your own, without a second thought. And every day since then, watching you with the children, seeing the way you've made this house a home, Clara. You're everything I didn't know I was looking for. But Rosalie is a lovely woman who deserves to find happiness, Marcus said firmly. But not with me. We both know that whatever I might have felt for the woman in that photograph, it's nothing compared to what I feel for the woman who answered my letters, who poured her heart onto paper in words that made me believe in the possibility of love again. Clara felt tears spill over, running down her cheeks to pool against Marcus's fingers. I wanted to tell you the truth. About the photograph, about why I really answered your advertisement. But I was so afraid. Of what? Of this moment. Of you realizing what I really am and sending me away. Marcus's answer was to lean forward and press his lips to hers, a kiss so gentle and reverent that Clara felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. When they broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers, their breath mingling in the space between. What you really are, he said softly, is the answer to every prayer I didn't know how to pray. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the circle of firelight, in Marcus's arms, Clara finally understood what it meant to come home. The climax. The storm lasted 3 days, during which time Clara lived in a suspended state of wonder and terror. Marcus's confession had changed everything, and nothing. She still served as housekeeper, still minded the boundaries of propriety. But now every glance carried weight, every casual touch burned with promise. They moved around each other like dancers, learning new steps, careful not to disturb the fragile understanding that had bloomed between them. Tommy recovered quickly, his young body bouncing back with the resilience of childhood, though he wore his stitches like a badge of honor and demanded to hear the story of his rescue at least twice daily. Sarah appointed herself his nurse, in Clara's shadow, following them both with the fierce protectiveness of someone who'd nearly lost what mattered most. Rosalie, meanwhile, remained mysteriously absent. She pleaded continued headaches and took her meals in her room, emerging only briefly to check on Tommy's progress before retreating again. Clara told herself her sister needed time to process the week's events, but a growing unease settled in her stomach like a stone. On the morning of the 4th day, the storm finally broke. Clara woke to brilliant sunshine streaming through her cabin windows and the sound of snow sliding from the roof in great wet chunks. The world outside had been transformed into something from a fairy tale, everything draped in pristine white icicles, hanging like crystal daggers from the eaves. the mountains rising against a sky so blue it hurt to look at. She was hanging laundry on the line Marcus had rigged in the kitchen when she heard voices from the front yard, Marcus's deep tones and another man's higher pitch. Clara wiped her hands on her apron and moved to the window, recognizing Dr. Morrison's slight figure as he climbed down from his sleigh. "Heard you had some excitement during the storm," the doctor was saying as Clara approached the front door. "How's the boy?" "Healing well, thanks to Miss Clara's skill with the needle," Marcus replied, and Clara felt warmth spread through her chest at the pride in his voice. Did he now? "Well, let's have a look at this handiwork." Clara found Tommy in the parlor, bouncing with excitement at having a visitor to show off his injury. Dr. Morrison examined the stitches with professional interest, his weathered hands gentle as he probed the healing wound. "Excellent work," he pronounced finally. "Clean, even stitches, proper spacing. Where did you learn to suture, Miss Clara?" "I assisted my father with injured parishioners sometimes," Clara said, embarrassed by the attention. "Though nothing as serious as this." "Natural talent, then. Have you ever considered studying medicine formally?" Clara blinked in surprise. "Medicine, but that is, women don't become doctors." "Some do," Dr. Morrison said with a slight smile. "There's a medical college for women in Philadelphia now. Of course, it would mean leaving Colorado, but if you have the calling—" "Miss Clara can't leave," Sarah announced with alarm. "She belongs here with us." "Indeed she does," Marcus said quietly, and something in his tone made Clara look at him sharply. Dr. Morrison caught the undercurrent as well, his sharp eyes moving between Clara and Marcus with unmistakable speculation. "Well, perhaps we could discuss setting up some informal training here. Mountain communities always need more medical knowledge, and you clearly have the instincts for it." After the doctor left, promising to return with medical texts and supplies, Clara found herself strangely unsettled. The idea of studying medicine, of having a profession beyond housekeeping, stirred something in her she'd thought long buried. But it also raised uncomfortable questions about her future, questions that became more pressing when Rosalie finally emerged from her self-imposed exile. Clara was preparing dinner when her sister appeared in the kitchen doorway, dressed for traveling in her best wool coat and carrying a small valise. "You're leaving." Clara said the words, not really a question. "The morning stage to Denver," Rosalie confirmed. "I've already spoken to Marcus. He's arranged passage for me." Clara set down her paring knife and turned to face her sister fully. "Rosalie, you don't have to." "Yes, I do." Rosalie's voice was calm, resigned. "We both know I was never meant for this life, Clara. I'm not cut out for children and cattle and making do with what's at hand. I need more, different." "Where will you go?" "San Francisco to start. There's a merchant I met at the hotel in Denver on my way here. He deals in fine fabrics, and he's offered me a position in his establishment." Rosalie's smile was the first genuine one Clara had seen from her in weeks. "It's respectable work, and it suits my particular talents." Clara felt a mixture of relief and sadness wash over her. "Are you sure?" "Completely." Rosalie stepped closer, her hands reaching for Clara's. "But there's something you need to understand before I go. Something I should have said years ago." Clara waited, her heart beating too fast. "I've spent 8 years watching you punish yourself for surviving that fire," Rosalie said quietly. "Watching you hide away like you were the one who died that night instead of Mama and Papa. But Clara, you didn't just survive, you saved me. You risked everything to pull me from that burning house, and you've been taking care of me ever since. That's what family does." "No, that..." Rosalie's grip tightened. "That's what love does. Sacrificial, selfless love. And you've been so busy protecting everyone else that you forgot to protect the most important thing of all, your own right to be happy." Tears blurred Clara's vision as 8 years of carefully buried grief rose to the surface. "You think those scars make you unworthy of love," Rosalie continued. "But all I see when I look at them is proof of the bravest person I've ever known. Marcus sees it too. He's been half in love with you since the day we arrived, though he was too honorable to say so while he thought he was promised to me." "Rosalie, let me finish." Rosalie's voice was fierce, now urgent. "I'm giving you permission, Clara. Permission to stop hiding, stop sacrificing, stop believing you don't deserve everything beautiful this world has to offer. Because you do deserve it. You deserve Marcus and those children, and this life you have built here. You deserve to be seen and known and loved for exactly who you are. Clara was crying openly now, the tears she'd held back for years, finally flowing free. Rosalie pulled her into a fierce embrace, and for a moment they were just two sisters who'd survived loss and found their way to different kinds of healing. Besides, Rosalie said when they broke apart, her tone deliberately light, someone needs to keep that man from walking into trees. He's hopeless without proper guidance. They were laughing through their tears when Marcus appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sound of their voices. He took in the scene: Rosalie's traveling clothes, Clara's tear-stained face, the valise by the door, and his expression grew carefully neutral. "The stage will be here soon," he said quietly. "Yes." Rosalie straightened her shoulders, every inch the lady she'd been raised to be. "Marcus, I need to say something before I go. Something important." Marcus nodded, his attention focused entirely on her words. "The woman you fell in love with through those letters, her intelligence, her kindness, her strength, that was always Clara. The photograph was mine, but everything else, everything that truly mattered, that was her. So when you ask her to marry you, and you'd better ask her, soon remember that you're not settling for second best. You're getting the woman you actually chose, even if you didn't know it at the time." With that pronouncement, Rosalie swept from the room to say goodbye to the children, leaving Clara and Marcus staring at each other across a kitchen that suddenly felt charged with possibility. "Is it true?" "No," Marcus asked, his voice carefully controlled. "About the letters," Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. "All of it, the stories about Boston, the thoughts about building a life in the wilderness, the dreams of quiet contentment." "All of it," Clara whispered. Marcus crossed the kitchen in 3 strides, his hands framing her face with reverent care. "Then I have something to ask you, Miss Clara Whitmore. Something I should have asked days ago." But before he could form the words, the sound of hoofbeats in the yard announced the arrival of more than just the morning stage. Through the window, Clara saw a group of riders approaching at speed, 6 men with grim faces and purposeful movements that spoke of trouble. Marcus heard them too, his head turning toward the sound with the sharp attention of a man who'd learned to read danger in the absence of sight. "Stay inside," he told Clara, already moving toward the gun rack by the door. But Clara was already moving too, her instincts screaming that whatever brought armed men to their door in the aftermath of a blizzard couldn't be good. She followed Marcus onto the porch, staying close enough to guide him if needed, but far enough back to avoid interfering with whatever was about to unfold. The lead rider dismounted with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to violence. He was tall and rangy, with cold eyes and a badge glinting on his coat. "Marshal Collins," Marcus said, recognition in his voice. "What brings you out here in such numbers?" "Bank robbery in Denver 3 days ago," the marshal replied without preamble. "Witnesses saw the gang heading into the mountains before the storm hit. We've been checking every ranch and cabin, looking for signs they might have taken shelter." "Haven't seen any strangers," Marcus said calmly, but Clara caught the tension in his shoulders. "Mind if we look around, check your outbuildings?" It was phrased as a request, but the marshal's tone made it clear that refusal wasn't an option. Marcus nodded his consent, and the men spread out across the property with practiced efficiency. Clara was watching the search when she heard a sound that made her blood run cold. From somewhere behind the house came the unmistakable whinny of a horse, answered immediately by several others. Too many horses, more than the Dalton ranch owned. The marshal heard it too, his hand moving to his gun as he gestured for his men to converge on the sound. Clara felt Marcus tense beside her, and she realized with horror that he was preparing to put himself between her and whatever danger was about to reveal itself. "Marcus, no," she began, but her words were cut off by the sharp crack of gunfire from behind the barn. What followed was chaos. Shouts and running figures, more gunshots, the children's terrified screams from inside the house. Marcus pushed Clara toward the door, his face grim with purpose. "Get the children to the cellar," he ordered. "Lock the door and don't come out until I come for you." "I'm not leaving you." "Clara, please." His hands gripped her shoulders with desperate strength. "I can't fight and worry about you at the same time. Please go." Clara looked into his face and saw not dismissal, but terrified love. He wasn't trying to exclude her from danger. He was trying to function, despite the fear of losing her. Understanding flooded through her, and with it a clarity that burned away years of self-doubt. "Come back to me," she said fiercely. then pressed a quick hard kiss to his lips before running for the house. She found the children huddled in the parlor, Tommy's face white with pain, as Sarah clung to his uninjured side. Rosalie stood frozen by the window, her traveling outfit a stark reminder of plans that would have to wait. "Cellar," Clara said tersely, gathering the children with efficient movements. "Now, bang." The root cellar was beneath the kitchen, accessible through a trap door that Clara had noticed but never had cause to use. It was dark and cramped, barely large enough for the four of them, but it was underground and hidden and safe. "What's happening?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the continued sounds of conflict outside. "Bad men," Clara said simply, "but the marshal is here, and Uncle Marcus is helping catch them." "Will Uncle Marcus be hurt?" Tommy asked, his young face etched with worry. Clara thought of Marcus moving through familiar territory that had suddenly become a battlefield, navigating by sound and memory, while men with guns hunted each other in his yard. The fear that gripped her was unlike anything she'd ever experienced, not for herself, but for the man whose safety had become more important than her own life. "Uncle Marcus is very clever," she told the children, forcing confidence into her voice. "He knows every inch of this ranch, every building and tree and hiding place. The bad men don't know those things." It was true, and Clara clung to that truth as the minutes stretched like hours. Above them, the sounds of conflict gradually faded, replaced by voices calling to each other in tones that suggested the immediate danger had passed. When Marcus's voice finally called down through the trapdoor, Clara felt something inside her chest unclench for the first time in what felt like hours. "Clara, children, you can come up now." They emerged, blinking into afternoon sunlight that seemed impossibly bright after the cellar's darkness. The yard was full of people, marshals and captured outlaws, neighbors who'd been summoned to help Dr. Morrison examining a wounded deputy. But Clara saw only Marcus standing whole and unharmed by the kitchen door, his face turning toward her, voice with the focused attention that had become as familiar as breathing. "Are you hurt?" she asked, her hands moving over his arms and chest with frantic efficiency, checking for injuries she couldn't see. "I'm fine," he assured her, catching her hands in his. "We're all fine. It's over." The outlaws, caught or killed, they'd been hiding in the old line shack up in the timber, waiting for the storm to pass before moving on. Marshal Collins thinks they might have been watching the house, planning to take what they needed and move on, but the law got here first. Clara shuddered at the implication. If the storm hadn't brought Dr. Morrison to check on Tommy, if the marshal hadn't been tracking the gang, if any number of things had been different. "Hey," Marcus's voice was gentle, his hands moving to frame her face. "We're safe. Everyone is safe." Clara looked up into his storm-gray eyes and felt the last of her defenses crumble. This man, this brave, good man, who'd faced armed outlaws to protect her and the children, who looked at her like she was precious beyond measure, who saw her scars as proof of courage rather than evidence of damage. He was hers if she had the courage to claim him. "Marcus," she said his name, a prayer and a promise. "I know," he said softly. "I know, love. We'll talk when—" "No." Clara's voice was stronger now, certain. "We'll talk now, right here in front of us, in half the territory if necessary." Marcus blinked in surprise, but Clara was already moving her hands, reaching for the high collar of her dress. With deliberate, careful movements, she began unfastening the buttons that had hidden her shame for 8 long years. "Clara, what are you, was fame? I'm showing you," she said simply. "All of me. The parts I've been hiding, the parts I thought made me unworthy. Because if you're going to love me, you need to love all of me." The collar fell away, revealing the twisted landscape of scars that mapped her shoulder and upper arm. In the bright afternoon sunlight, they were impossible to miss, raised and discolored, a permanent reminder of the worst night of her life. Around them, the yard had grown quiet. Clara was dimly aware of the marshal and his men of neighbors and strangers, all staring at the woman who'd bared her deepest shame in the middle of a public gathering. But their attention didn't matter. Only Marcus mattered, in the expression on his face as his fingers traced the familiar territory of her scars with infinite tenderness. "Beautiful," he said softly, his voice carrying clearly in the stillness. "Every mark, every line, every reminder of your courage. Beautiful." And suddenly Clara understood. Her scars weren't her shame, they were her story. They spoke of a woman who'd chosen love over safety, sacrifice over self-preservation, courage over fear. They were proof not of damage, but of strength. "I love you," she said, the words ringing out like a bell. "I love you, Marcus Dalton, and I want to marry you and raise your children and build a life in this beautiful place, if you'll have me." Marcus's answer was to sweep her into his arms and spin her around in a circle that made her laugh with pure, uncomplicated joy. When he set her down, his hands moved to cup her face with reverent care. "Miss Clara Whitmore," he said formally, though his eyes sparkled with mischief. "Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" "Yes," Clara said, and kissed him thoroughly while the assembled crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Resolution. The wedding took place 6 weeks later in Millbrook's small church decorated with pine boughs and winter berries that transformed the simple building into something magical. Clara wore her mother's ivory silk dress altered to accommodate her scarred arm with sleeves of delicate lace that revealed rather than concealed the marks that had become symbols of her strength. De Morrison walked her down the aisle in the absence of family, his weathered face beaming with pride. The entire community had turned out for the celebration ranchers and merchants miners and their wives, children, who'd grown to love their stories and songs. Even Mrs. Abernathy managed a genuine smile as Clara passed one over, despite herself, by the obvious joy radiating from the bride. Tommy and Sarah served as attendants, their faces shining with happiness, as they watched their beloved Clara become their new mother in truth as well as affection. Tommy bore his fading scar like a badge of honor, the mark that had brought them all together during that terrible, wonderful storm. Marcus waited at the altar in his best suit, his face turned toward Clara's voice as she moved down the aisle with measured steps. When she reached his side and placed her hand in his, Clara felt the last piece of her fractured heart slide into place. "Dearly beloved," the minister began, but Clara barely heard the familiar words over the thundering of her heart. She was thinking instead of the letter that had arrived the week before, Rosalie's careful script describing her new life in San Francisco, the respect she'd earned in her position, the gentleman merchant who'd begun calling on her with serious intentions. Her sister had found her own path to happiness, one that led away from mountain isolation toward the sophisticated life she'd always craved. Clara was thinking of the medical texts Dr. Morrison had begun bringing by the evening spent learning about anatomy and treatment, while Marcus listened with interest and the children played nearby. She would never be a formal physician, but she was becoming something equally valuable, a healer, a keeper of knowledge, a woman who could save lives when necessity demanded. She was thinking of the house that was truly hers now, where she could sing while she worked without shame, where her stories were treasured and her opinions valued, where love lived in every corner, like sunlight through clean windows. But mostly she was thinking of Marcus, this good, strong man who'd seen her heart before her scars, who'd chosen her not in spite of her marks, but because of the story they told about her character. "Do you, Clara Whitmore, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do," Clara said, her voice carrying clearly through the small church. "Do you, Marcus Dalton, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do," Marcus replied, his thumb tracing over the scars on her wrist where their hands joined. "Then by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Marcus, you may kiss your bride." Marcus's kiss was tender and sure, a promise of all the kisses to come, all the years they would have to learn each other's hearts. When they broke apart, the church erupted in celebration, but Clara heard only the whispered words Marcus spoke against her ear. "Welcome home, Mrs. Dalton." 5 years later, Clara stood on the porch of the house she'd come to as a temporary housekeeper and watched her husband teaching their daughter to ride. Little Rose was only 3, but she sat her pony with the fearless confidence of someone who'd been born to mountain life, her dark hair flying in the wind as Marcus led her around the paddock. "Careful, Papa," Sarah called from where she helped Tommy repair a section of fence. At 13, Sarah had grown into a poised young woman with her uncle's intelligence and her adoptive mother's practical nature. Tommy, now 15, was nearly as tall as Marcus and showing every sign of becoming a fine rancher himself. In Clara's arms, baby James dozed peacefully, oblivious to the chaos around him. At 6 months old, he was already showing signs of his father's stubborn streak and his mother's gift for finding mischief where none should exist. "He's going to be trouble, that one," Dr. Morrison observed, appearing at Clara's elbow, with the quiet step that had become familiar over the years. At 72, he was finally beginning to slow down, but he still made weekly visits to check on his informal student and her growing family. They all are, Clara said contentedly. The best kind of trouble. She watched Marcus boost Rose higher in her saddle, his face bright with laughter as their daughter shrieked with delight. The man who'd once navigated his world through careful limitation now moved through it with joyous confidence, secure in the knowledge that loving hands would guide him when guidance was needed and trust him to find his own way when it wasn't. The medical practice Clara had developed over the years had grown beyond anything she'd imagined possible. Women came from 3 counties to seek her help with difficult births. Men brought their injured children and animals, and everyone knew that Mrs. Dalton's kitchen was a place where healing happened alongside biscuits and common sense. The scars on her arm had faded with time, softened by years of Marcus's reverent touch and her own acceptance of their meaning. She still told stories to her children, to the women who came seeking help, to anyone who needed to hear that survival was possible and love could bloom in the most unlikely soil. Clara, Rose called from her pony. Tell Papa about the Dragon Princess. Again, Clara laughed. Don't you know that story by heart by now? It's different every time, Rose insisted with the logic of a 3-year-old. And Papa makes faces when you tell it. It was true Marcus had developed an elaborate repertoire of expressions to accompany Clara's stories, bringing characters to life with the same focused attention he brought to everything that mattered to him. Very well, Clara said, settling into the porch swing with James nestled against her shoulder. Once upon a time, there was a princess who thought she was too damaged to be loved. As her voice carried across the yard, Clara felt the same sense of completion that had filled her on her wedding day. This was her life, messy and challenging, and absolutely perfect in its imperfection. She was a woman who'd learned to see her scars as proof of courage, her survival as evidence of grace, her love as the most beautiful thing she had to offer. In the paddock, Marcus turned his face toward her voice with the same expression of wonder he'd worn that first day at the train station. Love, Clara had learned, was indeed the truest sight of all, and they all lived happily ever after.